Good afternoon. My name is Jane Tillman, and I'm the Evelyn Stephenson Neff Director of the Erikson Institute here at the Austen Riggs Center in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. I want to welcome you today to the second of 4 roundtables examining the experience of immigrants and refugees and how this diverse group shaped 20th century North American psychoanalysis. The Roundtable series honors the late Dr. Tony Chris, an immigrant from Vienna and supporter of the Sigmund Freud Museum. The Roundtable discussions are part of a larger project that the Erikson Institute is embarking on in collaboration with the Sigmund Freud Museum in Vienna, entitled From Despair to Hope: The Holocaust, Immigration, and Psychoanalysis in North America. This summer, here in Stockbridge, we will open an exhibition that has been at the Freud Museum that tells the story of the organized escape of psychoanalysts from Vienna in the 1930s. If you are in Stockbridge this summer, I invite you to visit the exhibit. As part of the exhibit, we're gathering stories of immigration, and we invite you to submit your story to us using the link that will appear in the chat periodically throughout this roundtable. As we begin, let me note that the Austen Riggs Center in Stockbridge is a town. Stockbridge was a town started as a mission to the Mohicans, who are the indigenous peoples of this land. With sometimes painful self-reflection and humility, we acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and gathering on their ancestral homelands. After enduring tremendous hardship and being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Muncie community. We honor and pay respect to their ancestors past and those present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. Thank you for joining us today. Now on to some housekeeping details. We will have the chat function on during the lecture, so please use it to comment and to let us know where you are joining from. You're eligible to receive 1.5 CE CME for today's live presentation. The chat section has information on how to complete the evaluation and receive credit and a certificate. Please be aware that it can take up to 24 hours for your attendance to register in our ethos system, and you must have attended the entirety of this webinar to receive credit. Now, I would like to introduce our colleague and collaborator, Dr. Daniela Fenzi, from the Sigmund Freud Museum in Vienna.
Thank you, Jane, and hello, good evening, everybody. Yes, my name is Daniela Fenzi. I'm from the Sigmund Freud Museum in Vienna, and I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all panelists and to all participants. And I would also like to take the opportunity to thank Eric Blanken, Jane Tillman, Alison Lotto for organizing this roundtable series together, and last but not least, of course, Thomas Kohut. Yes, as you already heard, this collaboration between the Erikson Institute of the Austen Riggs Center and the Sigmund Freud Museum in Vienna, Austria, includes different Zoom panel discussions. Today it's the second one. And there is also this exhibition project, the exhibition Organized Escape: Psychoanalysts in Exile, which will be on display in June in Stockbridge at the Erikson Institute. It's an adaptation of an exhibition which was developed in Vienna in 2021 in collaboration with members of the Arbeitsgruppe für die Geschichte der Psychoanalyse, the working group on the history of psychoanalysis, and it was entitled Organized Escape: Survival in Exile, Viennese Psychoanalysis 1938 and Beyond. In this exhibition, we were interested in how it became possible and who made it possible that all members of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society who were in danger could leave Vienna until spring 1939. But it was also extremely interesting to have a closer look to the so-called survival in exile, to the Weiterleben im Exil. As a matter of fact, for the Viennese emigrants, opportunities and careers opened up in the United States that would probably not have been accessible in Austria or elsewhere. I think it was Eli Zaretsky who in a text once described Viennese psychoanalysis as the greatest Austrian export item to the United States in the 20th in the 20th century. For psychoanalysis itself, this meant, of course, adaptation, transformation, a kind of Americanization. And so I'm very much looking forward to hear more about this by our talk today, with contributions of Adrian Harris, Lou Rose, Judy Kantrowitz, Elizabeth Lundbeck, moderated by Tom Cohood. Thank you for your attention, and I would like to give the word back to you, Jane. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. I will now introduce our moderator for today's roundtable, Dr. Thomas Cohood. Dr. Cohood is currently Sue and Edgar Wackenheim III Professor of History at Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts. He's also a longtime member of the Council of Scholars here at the Erikson Institute. Dr. Cohood is a graduate of the Cincinnati Psychoanalytic Institute and is also president of the Freud Foundation in the United States. Dr. Cohood has written 3 books: Empathy and the Historical Understanding of the Human Past, A German Generation, an Experiential History of the 20th Century, and Wilhelm II and the Germans, a study on leadership. I will now turn the program over to Dr. Cohood.
Okay, well, thank you, Jane. Thank you, Daniela. So as was mentioned, this is the second in a series of 4 panels on the experience of refugees and immigrants in the United States and their impact and contribution to American psychoanalysis. And the first 3 panels all focus primarily on the experience and impact of mostly Jewish refugees who fled Nazi Central Europe in the early 1940s and late 1930s, or during the 1930s and the early 1940s. The last panel focuses on the experience of more recent immigrant psychoanalysts, and that will be moderated by Spiros Orfanos. Anyway, so the first panel was a conversation between Nancy McWilliams, Otto Kernberg, and me, and we considered both my father's and Otto Kernberg's, my father Heinz Coates and Otto Kernberg's experience of anti-Semitic persecution in Austria and their flight from the Third Reich, and the influence that those experiences may have had on their respective theories of narcissism. So that was the first panel. And today we're going to move beyond Cohood and Kernberg to consider the impact on American psychoanalysis of other Jewish refugees from Central Europe, focusing specifically on Tony Chris, his father Ernst Chris, and Jewish refugees from Hungary. And Liz Lundbeck will make more general comments about the impact of Jewish refugees on American psychoanalysis. But it's really fitting that this panel opened with Judy Kantrowitz's remarks about Tony Chris, since this series of panels is dedicated to him, as was mentioned by Jane, not only because of his significance as a theoretician and a clinician and as a colleague, but also because of his support for the Freud Museum and also for the Austen Riggs Center in Stockbridge. Like his father Ernst and his mother Marianne, Tony was a refugee from Nazi Austria, and today's panel will open with remarks about Tony from his friend and colleague, Judy Kantrowitz, whom I will now introduce, and the introductions, as I've told the panelists, will be very brief. So Judy is a training and supervising analyst at the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute and formerly a clinical associate professor at Harvard Medical School. She is the author of 4 books: The Patient's Impact on the Analyst, Writing About Patients, Responsibilities, Risks, and Ramifications, Myths of Termination, What Patients Can Teach Analysts About Endings, and finally, The Role of Patient-Analyst Match in the Process and Outcome of Psychoanalysis. Judy served on the editorial board of the American Psychoanalytic Association, of the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association, and she's currently on the editorial board of the Psychoanalytic Quarterly. Judy is in private practice in Brookline, Massachusetts. Judy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, Tom, you said last time it was a job to be representing your father. I feel a little bit this way about Tony, too, who's kind of, well, we were kind of like siblings. I would say it's younger sister, but still. So when asked to join this panel, my first thoughts about what to present about Tony was about his creativity, his scholarship similar to his father's, his warmth and generosity similar to his mother's. He never talked about the impact of being from Austria or escaping to London with his parents as a young child, being sent with his sister to the countryside. I called Larry Hartman, Heinz's son, and asked him what he thought. He said, the Europeans brought culture. Tony identified as Jewish, but he was not at all observant. His father had converted to Catholicism. His mother was a Zionist. His first wife, Kitty, was not Jewish, but like himself, from an accomplished professional family. After her untimely death from cancer, he married Debbie, who was Jewish and on the opera board in Santa Fe. Culture mattered. Listening to the first roundtable, I was jolted into thinking about something which, of course, I know. What's not spoken, not present, has a powerful impact. Tony was a rebel. According to Larry, a difficult child who became a warm, nurturing, scholarly, and creative adult. Henry Nunberg, Herman's son and also my close friend, added that Tony, and he later, Henry, rebelled against the strict ego psychoanalysis that they had been taught. And this is how my lifelong friendship with Tony began. We were classmates at the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute beginning in 1968. The Boston Institute was fortunate to have prominent Central European psychoanalysts shape its early history. Helena and Felix Deutsch arrived in Boston in 1935. Greta and Edward Biebring were among its earliest members. According to Malcolm Ottman, the Biebrings were known for bringing ego psychology and their emphasis obviously on the ego, and the Deutsches for their emphasis on the id. Apparently, there was considerable rivalry between the two groups, and the Institute members aligned with one group or another. The Biebrings prevailed. The strict ego psychoanalysis we were taught, however, lacked the warmth and flexibility that apparently Greta had embodied. And I can say I was on the staff at the Beth Israel Wright Hospital, the psychiatry department, that she had headed and right before she retired. And she was known as this loving, creative, warm person. This was not the way we were taught. By the time I began my training in 1968, the Biebrings' ego psychology held sway in our training, unfortunately in a very dry and rigid way. But it was my good fortune to have Tony Chris in my class. He supported my dissatisfaction with what we were being taught and brought his creative and generous, loving heart to psychoanalysis, as well as to me and many others. Tony was born on July 26, 1934 in Vienna. His parents, Walter Ernst Chris, who went by Ernst, and Marianne Rye Chris, both were renowned psychoanalysts. They were part of Freud's innermost circle. Both he and his older sister, Anna, were to follow in their parents' career paths, establishing their own reputations as skilled psychoanalysts, supervisors, and teachers. The family left Vienna in the spring of 1938, traveling with Anna Freud and the Biebrings. They first went to London, and when the war broke out in England, Tony, Anna, and the Biebring children were sent outside of London. Eventually, via Canada, the Chris's arrived safely in the United States and settled in New York City. Tony combined the most positive aspect of his parents. He was warm and generous like his mother. The personal stories of how Marianne cared for and supported others are recounted by all who knew her. Tony did the same. He extended himself to almost anyone who he saw was in need and initiated contact, offering mentoring to many. Like his father Ernst, he was also a scholar. He rethought classical theory and found what he thought was positive preserve, and as he put it, unlearned, in quote, with what interfered with growth. Always his emphasis was on what was positive and adaptive. What we have, no matter how much we have to relinquish. This perspective characterized his outlook and his work. Tony wrote over 20 papers on psychoanalysis and a wonderful acclaimed book entitled Free Association, which provides a theory of clinical technique. Tony was a modern conflict theorist, and I'll say as an aside out of my prepared remarks that listening to the panel, the first panel, I thought how he stood right in the middle and found a place between what Kohut and Kernberg were saying. Tony introduced the idea of divergent conflict, an either-or dilemma, two conscious and incompatible ideas at war with each other. He illustrated how remaining with the patient's immersion in one side of the conflict would inevitably lead the patient swinging to the other, and after immersion there, back again to the first. Through this oscillation, like mourning, the conflict would eventually resolve. This idea is what Tony called divergent conflict, a complement to the classical idea of convergent conflict, where one side of the conflict is conscious and the other is repressed. Tony's focus was on patients' positive and adaptive capacities. Free association was his method, a method in which the analyst's interventions are intended to increase the patient's freedom in associating. For Tony, it's this expansion, irrespective of gains in insight or symptomatic relief, which is important. It is a focus on what the patient can do and is doing, rather than what the patient is reluctant, consciously, or resistant unconsciously to do. By encouraging patients to stay with their own ideas, first one side of the conflict, they themselves inevitably come to find a limitation that propelled them to see what they lost or gave up if they remain fixed in this stance. And similarly, as they consider the other side of the conflict. Tony's writings focused on helping patients find what they have, enabling them more easily to mourn what they need to relinquish. And you can begin to see how these ideas link to his interest and skill in working with narcissistic phenomena. Tony has pointed out that when patients are self-critical, neutrality needs to be defined on the basis of their internal state and not by some objective standard. Patients who tend to be self-critical experience silence as confirming their negative views of themselves. Analysts need to be aware of and actively address this phenomena. Self-criticism, when based on unconscious guilt, results in self-deprivation. He helped patients appreciate how they deprive themselves. Tony also believed that Freud's emphasis on aggression need to be rethought. He thought Freud overemphasized this. There was an excessiveness emphasis in interpretation as well of the transference by some schools of thought. He recognized his ideas had some parallel to Kohut's. He thought he had found a way to include them in a more classical psychoanalytic frame. Tony thought a lot about death. When you would see Tony, in greeting him, you would ask, "How are you?" His standard reply was, "Could be worse, probably will be." Although this was jocular, he had good reason for his caution. His father had had his first cardiac event at the age of 40 while monitoring the German radio communication system in Great Britain. He had heard the Germans break through the Maginot Line and understood the increased danger to the Allies. His father had survived, but he died of a heart attack at the age of 57. Tony was convinced that his fate would be the same. He rethought mourning, Freud's idea that all libidinal attachment to the lost object had to be given up. That was wrong. This idea had influenced many analysts and was destructive to patients. One does not need to give up the attachment to the past or the lost object, but only to mourn the loss of a future that cannot be shared with a loved one who dies. Tony had a TAA, small but alarming heart attack at 40, a triple bypass at 50, and a variety of smaller heart problems over the decades, dying of an aortic valve rupture in his mid-80s, living much longer than he ever thought he was. And parenthetically, my husband and I were with Tony when he had that first TIA on the vineyard, celebrating an introduction that Tony and I had made to a couple who then had a very happy life together. Matchmaking was also his too, and mine. Some of Tony's ideas about unlearning, to accept and embrace the value of contemporary relational theory, We do not need to reject the value of classical analytic theory or ego psychology, which taught us the value of mutative effects of insight through the content of interpretation. We are both old objects from the past and new objects who can see and help our patients expand their potentials. Intrapsychic and interpersonal conflicts coexist, and both influence who we are and who we become. We can continue to see the power of Oedipal dynamics with an expanded understanding brought by an appreciation of pre-Oedipal development. The meaning of separation enables us to understand anxiety with a new depth. Interpretation continues to be central to our analytic work, but it's the fact of our attempt to understand and interpret, rather than the correctness of the symbolic content of the interpretation, that often seems to be the most powerful agent of change. And these are just some of the highlights of his ideas about unlearning. I suggest all of you read his paper on that, because it's very useful and it integrates the old and the new. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Judy. It's my pleasure now to introduce my fellow historian. We have the historians like outnumber the analysts here, which is great. Lou Rose, who is the executive director of the Sigmund Freud Archives and professor emeritus of modern European history at Otterbein University. Lou is the author of 3 books: The Freudian Calling, Early Viennese Psychoanalysis and the Pursuit of Cultural Science; The Survival of Images, Art Historians, Psychoanalysts, and the Ancients; and most recently, Psychology, Art, and Anti-Fascism, Ernst Kriss, E.H. Gombrich, and the Politics of Caricature. Lou served as editor of the interdisciplinary psychoanalytic journal American Imago, and in 2017, he was awarded honorary membership in the American Psychoanalytic Association. Lou, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I just want to say how pleased I am to be able to participate in a panel in honor of Tony Kriss. My subject would be now his father. The Viennese emigrate analyst and art historian Ernst Kriss is well known for his role in the development of ego psychology and for his contribution to the psychoanalytic interpretation of art. He began both pursuits in Vienna before the Second World War. Each pursuit tested and expanded his key analytic concept of regression in the service of the ego. When we think about Kriss's influence on American psychoanalysis, after he left Vienna, we still rightly think of that impact in connection with his studies of the ego and his writings on culture. The example of Kriss, however, reminds us of another aspect of the psychoanalytic emigration, an aspect I want to emphasize here. When psychoanalysts came to America, they arrived not only as emigrant analysts, but also as refugees who had belonged to more than one profession or sphere of activity in their home countries. Kriss's influence on American psychoanalysis came perhaps as much from his non-psychoanalytic vocation and activities as from his psychoanalytic thought and work. Because he had participated in non-psychoanalytic callings and movements, he brought with him to the United States what I describe as an integrative approach to psychoanalysis. That approach emphasized the integration of psychoanalytic techniques, material, and concerns with methods, sources, and questions from areas outside of psychoanalysis. Kriss's commitment to intellectual integration expressed itself in the following 3 ways, which I want to mention here. The first, his political engagement. Kriss emigrated first to Britain in 1938 and then to the US in 1940. He arrived not only as a leading Viennese analyst and close colleague of Freud, but also as an internationally known scholar, an anti-fascist intellectual, and an exile seeking a new community, new citizenship, and new political activity. During the 1930s and early 1940s, he transformed from an Austrian liberal monarchist into a New Deal social democrat. The rise of the Popular Front mentality had a deep impact on his political transformation, and his psychoanalytic projects and ideas reflected that change. In his war work in Britain and the US, Chris monitored German radio broadcasts and wrote extensive propaganda analyses for government officials and research academics. While his shift toward propaganda analysis derived from immediate wartime needs, the move was also prepared by Chris's pre-war career and activities. That preparation included his art historical studies of myth, symbolism, and caricature, his psychoanalytic explorations of image making, and his historical and psychoanalytic research into the development of images as a form of communication. Perhaps most importantly, Chris's commitment to propaganda research reflected his serious concern with the psychological problem of defeatism within the Allied countries early in the war. In addition to his political engagement, Chris, as I said, was committed to a kind of intellectual integration. Throughout his career, he participated in intellectual and institutional worlds outside of psychoanalysis. Most importantly, Vienna's Kunsthistorisches Museum, where he was curator, the Warburg Library in Hamburg and its successor Warburg Institute in London, the New School for Social Research in New York, and the Totalitarian Communication Project organized by the Rockefeller Foundation and directed by John Marshall during the Second World War. Chris's early collaboration and continuous collaboration with E.H. Gombrich and their joint participation in war work in Britain and America encapsulated Chris's integrative intellectual approach. He renounced, I would say, a unified or universal theoretical model, either both in propaganda research and psychoanalysis. Chris shared that perspective, a perspective I think which mirrored the mindset of the Allied war effort, with diverse researchers during the 1930s and 1940s. Iris Berry, who directed the film archives at the Museum of Modern Art, including its propaganda films, wrote that propaganda research needed to utilize, in her words, integrated content analysis. The Columbia sociologist Robert S. Lind, who co-authored with Helen Merrill Lind the seminal sociological study of Middletown, applied a similar intellectual approach. Chris became acquainted with Lind through Lind's radio research project and Lind's work with the Rockefeller Foundation. Chris described Lind in a letter to Gombrich as follows, quote, "Robert Lind, whom you seem to consider as typical American, is undoubtedly one of the leading, if not the leading American sociologist. He is a true leftist to the left of ordinary Marxists and is undoubtedly a brilliant man," end quote. He added that Lind was, in Chris's phrase, typical only of himself. For Chris, Iris Berry, Robert Lind, and other scholars, to engage in integrated research meant building bridges between a variety of interpretive methods and perspectives rather than creating a single all-encompassing interpretive framework. That effort extended from Chris's wartime propaganda research and image studies to his post-war child studies and memory research, to his development of a psychoanalytic science of the mind, of which ego psychology formed one part. Finally, I want to draw attention to Chris's, what I would call Chris's non-reductive Freudian approach. In line with his overall integrative aims, Chris followed a non-reductionist approach in his psychoanalytic endeavors. As the example of Erikson within psychoanalysis and Herbert Marcuse outside of it demonstrated, Chris was far from the only scholar to encourage psychoanalysts to master the tools and apply the insights of other disciplines. But Chris stood apart in his attempt to integrate the techniques and concepts that characterize non-psychoanalytic disciplines with a psychoanalysis that was continually grounded in and fundamentally committed to Freudian practices and ideas. For Chris, Freud's emphasis on overdetermination in mental life was essential to a non-reductionist approach. One finds a similar emphasis in Chris's concept of regression in the service of the ego. For Chris, the ego gained access to and worked with multiple unconscious influences, which it transformed or shaped into diverse forms of social and creative communication. Both stages in the process, unconscious regression and conscious communication, required equal and related study. In Chris's view, the principle of overdetermination could refer to cultural, political, and historical influences, as well as psychological ones. And therefore, it called for knowledge and tools from both within and from outside psychoanalysis. In summary, I would just like to say Chris's influence on psychoanalysis in the US went beyond his role in ego psychology, in the study of art, and in the debates and the controversies that surrounded those fields. Here, I simply wanted to stress his emphasis on doing justice to methods and concepts from diverse disciplines, his effort at the intellectual integration rather than the theoretical unification of psychoanalytic and non-psychoanalytic approaches, and his commitment to a non-reductive Freudian perspective. Again, I appreciate being able to speak. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Lou. It's my pleasure now to introduce Adrienne Harris, PhD, who's on the faculty and a supervisor in New York University's postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. She's also on the faculty and a supervisor at the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California. She's a member and a training analyst in the International Psychoanalytic Association, and she's an editor of Psychoanalytic Dialogues and Studies in Gender and Sexuality. Adrienne.
Thank you so much. I'm very pleased and moved to be at this meeting. In 2019, I organized a conference at the Sandor Ferenczi Center at the New School. That conference, like much of what I'm hearing already in this meeting, was fascinating and also heartbreaking. And in a few short months, that conference is going to appear in a book form. Sometimes you do a conference to talk about things you already know and think, and sometimes the conference is the site of unexpected but crucial learning. And I feel that about this event as well. But Emigrate Analysts, which is the title of the conference in the book, was such a project. I think of myself as somebody very rooted in history and conscious of politics and history. And I think it's really important for us to try to think about and understand how much of this history of our own discipline has been too invisible. I think we need to speak about that and try to think about the eclipsing of the sort of political background and heartbreaking background of some of our, as Lou Rose has been describing, most esteemed colleagues. The papers and discussions in my conference explored migrations and movements. Sometimes these were chosen and sometimes the movements unchosen and often done in deepest danger. The first section of the conference focused on analysts who had to flee fascism from Europe, very much like Chris, as Lou Rose described. And this was all in the background of the rise of fascism, the Holocaust, and the Second World War. But in addition to the harrowing narrative of escape and danger, people at this conference spoke of the climate, both political and social, greeting people thrown into exile. Let's remember that this all happens and people arrived very much into the political world of McCarthyism and the varieties of antagonism and opposition to liberal thought, and also antagonism to the special climate of psychoanalysis. I think there's a history that we need to read and understand in our field, and that it's so easily eclipsed and kind of done away with. Some part of the conference was also about the future and about the present. Rogelio Sosniak, an analyst in New York, spoke about work he has been doing to make safe havens for contemporary exiles and refugees. There is an IPA committee that is working with refugees. In 2017, there's an IPA committee on relocation that was formed and is in the business of helping people to escape from danger. There was another paper by Irene Caro in this conference, and she wrote about the particular meaning and challenge when exile occurs with no hope of return. I think that's a dimension of exile to think about. What happens when exile really is the loss of a civilization, sometimes a language, a world, a life? Somebody else in the conference Adam Brown, who works with children and refugee situations in South America. He addressed the need for early intervention in refugee populations, particularly those involving children, whom he rightly called at this conference among the world's most vulnerable populations. So I think there's a lot to think about: who is seeking asylum, who leaves, what do children need, what do families need, what do individual needs. And we were certainly talking at that conference about the particular fate of and demands on women analysts who are often at particular risks. So I think that for me, the project of this conference that we're at now and the project of the Emigrate Analyst Conference is that we need to wonder why this history gets so easily lost. And why we don't hold on in psychoanalysis to our own history. Psychoanalysts are all about history and remembering history and not forgetting. And yet there's a kind of omission and repression that keeps our political background and our stories too easily rendered invisible. And I hope in our discussion we can sort of look into some of these questions. There are also some current projects that I think are very important. I want to mention. In particular, I'm very grateful to the head of postdoc, Spiros Orfanos and Barbara Isold, who've been undertaking in context of with PHR, Physicians for Human Responsibility, writing support documents for people seeking asylum who are already in the US and are seeking to have permanent residency here. This is often a heartbreaking project to interview and to hear these stories and to support this community, including a community of children who are very much in our need. So I think what I want to say about this topic and about this conference is that there's a history we need to know. There's a political and social set of programs and problems we need to be actively working on. This needs to be not just a conference about papers and talking, but also about activism and action. And I hope that can be part of this project as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Adrienne. So our last presenter is Elizabeth Lundbeck, who's a historian of psychoanalysis, psychiatry, and psychology, and professor and chair of the Department of History of Science at Harvard University. She's the author and editor of numerous books, including The Americanization of Narcissism, The Psychiatric Persuasion, Knowledge, Gender, and Power in Modern America. She teaches courses focused on psychoanalysis and is currently offering a popular course in Harvard's program in general education called Psychotherapy and the Modern Self. She's now working on a book called The Magic of Words, Talking Cures from Freud to TikTok. Liz.
Hey, thank you. It's great to be here. And before I go into my remarks, I just want to make a couple short comments. One is that Tony was a valued friend and colleague of mine as well. We spent a lot of time talking about narcissism, and he talked about his own narcissism and how his marriages has cured him of it, and just an incredibly warm, thoughtful presence at BIPSI. I want to reference Jim Anderson's anecdote in the chat. Tony was very proud of that. And when I went to visit Chicago, he told me to definitely take a look at that letter on the wall of the Chicago Institute. I think he found it just to have that kind of tie to Freud to him was very important, and talked about playing under the table with his sister at the when the Freuds would come to visit for dinner. So I'm going to talk about I want to raise some of the issues that came up in the conversation in the first of these among Otto Kernberg, Tom Kohut, and Nancy McWilliams. And in particular, I'm interested in exploring the authoritarianism of the refugee analysts that was raised by Otto Kernberg and discussed by the other panelists. I'd like to think about how that is related to what seems to be, in my sense, the anti-traumatic and post-war American ego psychology. So some background on the ego psychologist to add to what everybody else has already provided. The emigrate ego psychologists were foundational to the efflorescence of psychoanalysis in the United States in the post-war period. They put psychoanalysis on the map in the United States. Without them, we wouldn't have American psychoanalysis as we know it now. They took over the American psychoanalytic and psychiatric establishment. They rose to positions of prominence within it, serving as chairs of departments of psychiatry across the country, which is just an unimaginable sort of achievement today, given how eclipsed psychoanalysis has been in mainstream psychiatry. Psychoanalysis is also the stuff of middle and highbrow culture. It was discussed in magazines. It was discussed in popular best-selling books and in colleges and universities. Erikson, for example, taught a huge course at Harvard on identity while he was a professor there. And his 1960 book, Gandhi's Truth, was a bestseller. It was awarded the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. It's hard to imagine a psychoanalytic book winning those awards today, just as a measure of the achievement of the ego psychologist. In the 1970s, events featuring Heinz Kohut and Otto Kernberg speaking on the topic of narcissism drew substantial crowds and a lot of popular positive press attention, for example, in People magazine. So the achievements of these analysts were monumental. And I think that the emigrate analysts are deserving of a huge amount of credit for effecting that change and sort of cultural prominence. So how did they do it? One explanation often given by historians is that their theory, called ego psychology, fit well with the post-war American ethos of fitting in. So this ethos, you're probably familiar with it, was captured and critiqued in such landmark works of sociology and social criticism as David Reisman's The Lonely Crowd, which was published in 1950, and is the best-selling work of sociology in the 20th century, American sociology, and also in William H. White's The Organization Man, which was published in 1956. So these critiqued the post-war American ethos of just fitting in, getting along with others. Ego psychology's stress on adapting to and conforming to the status quo has been seen as exemplary of this moment when social conformity and political compliance were expected. But also, as I've suggested, importantly, they were critiqued by some observers. As one has argued, ego psychology's emphasis on adaptation, the independence and importance of the ego, and the realm of conflict-free functioning seems politically right at home in 1950s and 1960s America. Ego psychology was, by this interpretation, a psychology of compliance, and its practitioners unwittingly facilitated the state's ability to control the populace in endorsing compliance to the cultural frame. There was a version of this interpretation offered at the last symposium. It's a popular line of argument that participants invoked Hartman's ego psychology and its signature concept of the ego's conflict-free sphere, and stressed that ego psychology prevailed in part because it harmonized with American culture. Now, there's something to this, and it is consonant with a certain, ego psychology is consonant with a certain American optimism that was foreign to European sensibilities. It is certainly consonant as well with cultural narratives about the oversized American ego. As a recent headline in the Times of London proclaimed in a recent iteration of this perspective, brag like an American to get ahead at work, British told. So Otto Kernberg suggested that German and Austrian Jewish analysts who flocked to America, he suggested that they imbibed an authoritarian cast of mind from a young age. As he put it, and as you know, Kernberg's been a very vocal critique of authoritarianism in psychoanalytic organizations. As he put it, they were, quote, indoctrinated into authoritarian educational systems. Others agreed, the other panelists agreed, and later in the conversation invoked the ego psychologist's silence, their comfort with silence in the consulting room as a matter of technique, but also their silence about the Holocaust, the death camps, their own experiences, and the humiliation and shame of their own helplessness and defeat. They're being driven out of their homelands. And Tom Cohen had especially interesting and suggestive remarks to make on this. What I would like to focus on for the rest of my time here is the question, can we find or see or identify this authoritarianism, not only in the practice of ego psychologists, what they did in their consulting rooms, their vision of technique, or even their running of psychoanalytic institutes. And just to make a gesture towards Adrienne's paper, if we want to find or sort of memorialize authoritarianism in the history of psychoanalysis, you need only look at the treatment of Ferenczi for years and years, who was just written out of psychoanalysis. So did they also situate this authoritarianism at the heart of their theory? So I'm going to start with Robert Wallerstein's brilliant observation on ego psychology as a starting point. Refugee analysts, he argued, in Coming to America, treated Freud as, quote, a precious gift handed down to be preserved and protected from dilution, end quote. This is at once on target and misleading. Wallerstein is on target in a way that hasn't been sufficiently emphasized, I would suggest. And that is the ego psychologist Freud was an anti-traumatic Freud. In asserting this, I'm referencing Ferenczi and his understanding of Freud, which appears in his clinical diary. Quote, the anti-traumatic in Freud is a protective device against insight into his own weaknesses. A stunning observation. Thinking analogically, can we understand the anti-traumatic in ego psychology as a protective device against the refugee analyst's own vulnerabilities, which, as Tom Cohen so persuasively suggested, were both monumental and not to be spoken of. Wallerstein is less on target if we look at ego psychology's characterization of the ego, because their ego, I would suggest, is not Freud's ego. The ego of ego psychology grew ever more sovereign, masterful, and powerful than it was in Freud's theorizing. Freud's ego was embattled. As he wrote, this is in The Ego and the Id, the ego was entrusted with important functions, among them the modest but devilishly difficult task of harmonizing relations among the mind's three agencies. But it was as weak, he suggested, as a constitutional monarch, without whose sanction no law can be passed, but who hesitates long before imposing his veto on any measure put forward by Parliament. In relation to the id, the ego was no royal, but a commoner, a man on horseback who has to hold in check the superior strength of the horse, obliged to guide it where it wants to go. And more worrying, its weakness meant in negotiations with other actors, it could become sycophantic, opportunistic, and lying, like a politician who sees the truth but wants to keep his place in the popular favor. The mind, Freud would later wrote, is not a peaceful, self-contained unity, but something like a modern state, susceptible to being overrun by the mob as id, eager for enjoyment and destruction. Fashioning themselves the true and only heirs to Freudian orthodoxy, the ego psychologists, as I've suggested, quickly established themselves at the center of the American analytic establishment, and relatedly, the ego at the center of the personality. Their ego would be no weakling, as Philip Reith characterized the Freudian ego, nor would it be a servile, pliant, beleaguered, far from omnipotent negotiator mediating amongst hostile forces. The ego psychologist's therapeutic interventions would likewise offer more than the Freudian managerial virtues of prudence and compromise. Rather, the ego psychological program involved enhancing the ego's authority and realm of action vis-a-vis both of the mind's other agencies. Heinz Hartmann, the intellectual leader of this group of analysts, allowed that it was reasonable to see the ego's conflicts in Freudian terms, in terms of the war it wages against the id, superego, and external reality. But he asked, adopting Freud's implicit casting of the ego as state actor, were not admittedly bellicose nations also engaged in peaceful administrative, legislative, and economic activities on behalf of their populations? So the outside American ego is familiar enough to us. It has sparked a chorus of complaints. It has been implicated in popular construals of the American pathology of narcissism, linked to selfishness and too much self-esteem, and a general overestimation of the self's importance. Heinz Kohut, in opposition to the ego psychological line of argument, suggested that the cure was not to consist in the expansion of the ego sphere of influence, referencing where it was their ego shall be. Rather, Kohut shifted the argument to the new ground of feelings, of complex emotional states. Treatment was relational, consisting not in pacifying new territory, but in meeting patients' needs for merger with parental figures. And here I'll just say that Tony, in conversation and in a footnote in one of his articles, credited Kohut with really pushing him away off from, in terms of technique, the strict neutrality of the ego psychologist. The analyst preoccupied with mechanisms focused on the mental apparatus as Kohut saw things. His focus was rather on the complexities of personality and individuality. The outsized American ego, enhanced vis-a-vis its European forebears in the land of democracy, doesn't at first glance square with the interpretation of authoritarianism. It was strong, defiant, and inflated. Yet it does certainly fit neatly under the rubric of anti-traumatic. As Hartmann argued, the ego, like the state, properly engaged in a range of peaceful, facilitative endeavors. So the authoritarianism that I'm pulling in from last time's conversation, and we can talk about, the ego and the analyst in ego psychology were both masterful. And I'd just like to end with a question about the underside of this, the shame and humiliation that Tom Kohut mentioned last time. To what extent did the claims to mastery serve to paper over painful feelings of shame and humiliation and helplessness? And did that papering over contribute to the exaggeratedly strong American psychological ego psychology ego? Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Liz, and everyone else. And I just would like to open up the floor at this point for the panelists to make any comments or respond to what they've heard from their fellow panelists.
Myself, sorry. I was really, can you hear me? I was really interested in, I hadn't thought myself to think about the sort of deconstruction of ego psychology in the light of the trauma of migration. But I think it's actually, and it's the question Elizabeth ended with, just what's the relationship of a theory that theorizes and constructs shame in this way and the history of the emigrating analysts who built it. I think it's just a really interesting, you don't want to collapse theory and
Right.
do too simple-minded a link, but I think there's something, just the agony of this, and who was, was there what help was there? What for how, shaming everything had been. So I really think that made me think a lot. Elizabeth, thank you.
Yeah, I found myself thinking a lot about Tony's own experience with some of this, because his, he's had many treatments over the years, but when he started at the Boston Psychoanalytic, he was shamed a lot. He was, he was arrogant, but he knew a lot. He offered a lot. But our professors, who I think knew a lot less than he did, took his arrogance in this way. And it was quite awful. I mean, I remember sitting through classes where he was put down in ways, and it was really hard. He himself would say that it wasn't until his analysis later with Jacques Murray that things really changed for him. I think that's rather unfair, because he was quite wonderful early on. Yes, this was an issue, but he was generous and kind, and he wasn't just an egoist in this way. But interestingly, in this, one of the things is he cites this moment where Jacques Murray got up and stood in front of the end of the couch, pointed his finger at him, and said, "Who do you think you are?" So, I mean, it was an interesting juxtaposition with confronting a kind of narcissism with a man who he felt really loved by and cared about and respected. And it was that combination about being able to say that and still feel how he is valued that I think really made a lot of difference. And we did have this I think the worst of ego psychology is what we were taught, because it didn't have this creative part, the adaptive part. It just was, putting you down. And one of the things that Tony also emphasized was in his unlearning was the importance of not internalizing the way you were treated in this disparaging way. The whole issues around narcissism and this. And, I think Liz has given just a wonderful picture of what that ego psychology was like in its best and worst forms. I mean, it offered a lot, but it imposed a lot that had to be unlearned. And I do think that Heinz Kohut was a breath of fresh air to a lot of us. As I told Tom, I met him in 1972. The Ornsteins invited Evie Schwager and me to come and meet him. And it was like, somebody who has a sense of what a development of the self is with a kind of respect. So, the issues of this balance between what's offered and what's restricted, I think Liz emphasized really well, because there was so much that the ego psychologists brought in terms of what they taught us, in terms of what they knew, in terms of European culture. And I'll add with this, Larry Hartman pointed out something else, which we haven't talked about, and that's the difference in their attitudes toward homosexuality. That people were reluctant to apply if they were homosexual, because they were sure this is something that was not going to be accepted in the United States. And it was really quite hard. It took a long time for that to change. But the Europeans in general did not have this attitude. And this is something else that they brought.
I appreciate everything both of you have said. I just want to give some credit to Tom here, because I had not really thought about this before. I mean, I've written a book on narcissism, but I had not thought about the focus in his father's work on shame and humiliation, and the relationship of that to I don't want to, just layer over experience and theory. I don't think there's a one-to-one, but I think that we haven't paid enough attention to that. And, there's been a lot of talk about how analysts couldn't confront the Holocaust, didn't talk about it, there was the silence, but I think there's a really interesting story there to be told. The work of those two analysts really changed psychoanalysis so much for the better. I think American psychoanalysis was in a bad state by the 60s and early 70s. It had been so thinned out. If you read Leo Stone's book, for example, Psychoanalytic Situation, there was just like such a thin reed there. And it took just this incredible blast of new theorizing and new thinking. And I think both sides were necessary. And I actually, I've thought about this a lot. I think there was a tremendous amount of agreement between the two figures that's been lost because people need to pull them out to be able to see the two poles. But I think what's really been lost, and I hope, Tom, you'll deal with this in your upcoming book and research, is these feelings that can't be spoken of because they're so shameful. Not just that they're horrific, but they're shameful.
Yeah.
I'm the moderator, but it's really hard not to say something. And partly just because I think, the talks really harmonize well. And the first thought is a kind of a world that we lost that is maybe now coming back is the first thought I had. And that goes back to it's in your presentation of Ernst Chris, Judy, it was in your comment too, is the word culture, the importance of culture that the emigrate refugee analysts brought to America. And, if you just think not just Freud, but if you think about, and in Ernst Chris, you think about Kurt Eisler or Richard Sturba or Bruno Bettelheim or my father, and of course, above all, maybe Erikson, all of these people learned from culture, from things beyond the clinical setting. They brought their knowledge of culture to bear on the clinical, and their understanding of the clinical had an impact on how how people understood the cultural world. So I think that was kind of lost, but I think it's coming back. That's why we have this panel is a good example of why it's coming back. And it gets back to, Adrian, your comment about this hidden history that needs to be talked about. Well, that's what we're doing. And I think we need to do maybe more of that.
Yes.
And, it's great that this is being sponsored by the Erikson Institute, which is is kind of kept this notion alive at Austen Riggs. And I think it's now, much more prominent than it was. And I thought it's also very interesting, Lou, that I hadn't thought about when I think about culture, is you talked about Ernst Chris's political engagement, which is something that I think people like my father and Eisler, they didn't go there. But I do think today, suddenly now, perhaps in connection with Black Lives Matter and other things, there is in psychoanalysis a new emphasis and focus on the political, on institutional racism, on white privilege, and on political and social justice and psychoanalysis relationship. So there's a way that there's a return to that. And I think there's also, getting back again to Lou, your comments, Ernst Chris was not reductive. He was integrative. He was trying to learn and build bridges to other disciplines. And that, again, was something that was not present when I was going through psychoanalytic training at all. And I think much today, psychoanalysis is far more eclectic than it used to be. And we don't have these rigid schools and these, attached to individual male figures that one is a such and such or a such and such. So I think there's that the world that was lost and initially is maybe now coming back. That was the one thing. And then the other thing I just like to very quickly say is that there is this disconnect, which Liz, you talked about extensively, I think, between the way ego psychologists talked about the ego, which was far less defensive, far more optimistic, far more creative, far more positive. And this is something, Judy, you talked about at length in relation to Tony. You talked about his warm, loving heart, and he brought, I think, this warm, loving, psychoanalysis has a warm, loving heart too, and that tended to be kind of overshadowed by this rather much more austere kind of psychoanalytic approach that I was encountering in my psychoanalytic education. So on the one hand, you have this kind of this ego that is conceived of in this very creative, positive, not defensive, not embattled, not beleaguered, not actually fairly powerless way that Freud thought of it. And also, let's not forget Freud's pessimism at the end, certainly at the end of his life. This was a much more optimistic way. And how that connects with again, Judy, you talked about it in your paper. I experienced it firsthand, how dogmatic and rigid my psychoanalytic education was. we had one day, I think, in the whole, my 6 years of training, or maybe one weekend, where we talked about Melanie Klein and Karen Horney and Heinz Kohut. And, it was absurd. But I don't understand. I think somehow this authoritarianism has got to be connected with the traumatic experience of the Holocaust.
That's,
I also think too, that the political climate in the US, sort of around McCarthy and that post-McCarthyism, was terrifying, surely, for this generation of, where they were leaving was catastrophic, but the political world of America in the 50s was not very hospitable. And I just think it's interesting to think about when there's space for, things on race and gender and sexuality, where there can be a more liberated psychoanalytic culture, but it has some ties to the political culture as well. And I just think it's important to sort of think about not just where they were coming from, but where they were arriving to.
Yeah, I think to just follow up on some of these thoughts. I think one of the reasons Chris was less dogmatic, I won't say, there was an absence of dogmatism, but less dogmatic, is because Chris was always conscious of loss and felt a sense of loss.
Mm-hmm.
He was never where he wanted to be.
Mm-hmm.
When he was the curator at the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, he wanted to be instead a medical psychologist, but Freud advised him not to change. When he had to leave Vienna for London, and then when he left London, had to leave London for Canada and the US, he did not want to remain in the US. He wanted to be back in Britain. And he wrote letters to his associates there that he, as of 1942 or 43, he now had to give up on getting back to Britain. Ernst Gombrich wanted Chris to become the director of the Warburg Institute in London in 48 after Fritz Zoxel's death. And Chris realized that would now be out of the question. And I think that he also felt a sense of loss. I think during the war and immediately after the war, when he was working with so many different individuals, not emigres, but also individuals from different backgrounds and from different scholarly backgrounds, there was a kind of activity he was engaged in that I think he felt the loss of as the Cold War set in. And I really, Chris's most kind of integrative period, so to speak, was that mid-30s to late 40s, early 50s. And wanted, I think in the 50s, he wanted to try and get it back. He wanted to get it back, but even that was, in a sense, lost.
so that's so interesting because, Erikson, who was a kind of Chris-like figure in that way, in that he just absorbed vast swathes of anthropological, historical, sociological literature, was first he left Berkeley because of the McCarthyism. He was written out by the Orthodox American ego psychologists as too sociological. Yep. So that the narrowing, so that the kind of damage that somehow was carried through. It's just remarkable to me because he was also the best-selling, most famous psychoanalyst at the time. But analyst after analyst said he's not a psychoanalyst, which is just a remarkable statement. And it's kind of says something about what was lost, to go to your point about, this kind of larger kind of engagement with the world to a very narrow view of what a psychoanalyst was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really struck by what you're describing, Tulu, because I think that this is, again, speaks to Tony's emphasis on the adaptive, because this was a major thing for him to think about mourning, as I cited, that you don't have to think of giving up the past. You can keep it alive, you can keep that attachment, but you do have to mourn that you can't go back. And just as an aside here, there's an absolutely wonderful portrayal of this in this book by Cole Tobin on Thomas Mann called The Magician, which is about what it means to lose your homeland and how to never feel like where you are, it's home, and always to have that yearning for it. I mean, it's just, it so much speaks to what you're describing. And maybe, this is to the point too, that Tony also was a cultured person in many ways. He brought many things to think about that weren't just about analysis per se. And this fits with Ernst, who was an art historian, and this broader way of thinking about things. Something happened in trying to preserve some of this that, I mean, you have to wonder too, whether the embattled state of the ego psychologists with, the whole issue about being a physician, this was, the Europeans were much better about this, but what happened in the United States is it went into a very dry, very restrictive notion about who could be an analyst. So, the whole issue of balancing authoritarianism. And I think Adrian's point about McCarthyism is very central, because we were in a culture that it was dangerous to think differently, to speak out, to have ideas that were, would expand who we were. So, the 60s liberated a lot of things, but it took longer for psychoanalysis to get liberated. As, I think Tom and I had very similar experiences, a really stultifying education, miracle to think that, we would end up wanting to do this work in some way, but, some of us survived.
Yeah, well, just one thing on the fitting in, the need to fit in, and that its relationship to the McCarthyist, the mood in the US is, and there's a lot of literature about this, the whole desire to be a science. And I've just, what would ego psychology have been like in the United States if it had been called I psychology? Which is, after all, what it was called in Europe, in Germany, and German-speaking countries. It's, there's a kind of, I don't know, austerity that's built into the concept ego psychology. It's not nearly as what my father would have called experience near, as to say I psychology. So, that's really interesting.
Well, I just want to, we should probably get to the questions soon, but I just wanted to say about the issue of McCarthyism, I would like to just put on the table that I think the restraint was as much from within as from without. And I think it's not on the grounds of authority. It's really about these intolerable feelings of helplessness and shame. And that's where I see the anti-traumatic. So what do? You make a psychology in which the ego just is fully the master, which is very un-Freudian. So people have written about ego psychology fitting in adaptation, but no one's really written about the anti-traumatic nature of it. And I hadn't even really thought about it until I went to this wonderful thing that Kernberg and Tom spoke at a few weeks ago.
I think the link between helplessness and shame is also very important in this regard, that there's just a lot of data on what that mix of helplessness and shame produces in the way of sort of anger and destructiveness, and it's a very, very toxic combination.
Well, and the helplessness and shame not only comes from the experiences of persecution and flight. Otto Kernberg described watching his mother having to clean the sidewalks of Vienna with a howling crowd observing her. He's standing there watching his mother do this. But Adrian, you mentioned this too. It's like, I had this with my father. He's living in a country and he can't really speak the language, and I don't know if any of you have spent any length of time living in a foreign country, but if you have, it's infantilizing. small children can speak the language and figure out things better than you can. And so it's not just what they fled from, but it's experience
they
they
went to,
got
for
to
sure.
that increases these feelings of helplessness and shame. Well, Jane, would you have Jane and Daniela, do you have any questions or comments for us?
This has been so fascinating, and thank you. And we do have some questions from our participants today. So here's a question that I think may get to the issue of the anti-traumatic project of ego psychology. This person says, I have the perception that psychoanalysts weren't early appreciators of the rise and mortal relevance of Hitler, who had been in prison for treason for a decade prior and burned Parliament down, and fascism in general. I understand Freud himself was dragged out of his house at the last minute, and this saved his life. But what does the team, what do our panelists make of this perception? Is it correct? Meaning, were psychoanalysts in general not appreciators of the rise and mortal relevance of Hitler? I'm thinking this introduces denial as an aspect of an anti-traumatic lens.
The
I mean,
thing about psychoanalysis is that denial doesn't actually work. That the trauma that we're outlining, it may be sort of faced over. There may be some kind of false self that kind of operates, but I don't think you have those experiences and don't feel traumatic, even if it remains very, very negated and denied in your own psyche. So I don't think that's right, that construction.
I'd just like to also add to that, though, that it's not just true of psychoanalysts. I mean, there were a lot of people who could not, I mean, how do you comprehend that, especially if you're German and you believe in German culture and you believe, I mean, my mother-in-law she only got out by the skin of her teeth because her family actually believed that they were accepted by Germans. So I don't think it's just psychoanalysts.
Yeah, I would emphasize that. And to cite just one case, the difference between Ernst Chris and his student and later collaborator, E.H. Gombrich. Chris was only 9 years older than Gombrich, but there was a great difference between their realization of what was happening. Chris, very, very early, came to the conclusions that Austria would become, if not part of the Reich, then the Nazi party within Austria would eventually take hold. And Gombrich, still couldn't bring himself to believe this was going to happen. And Chris kept telling him, you've got to get out, you've got to get out. And Chris tried to help other scholars get out. He worked with the Academic Assistance Council in Britain, gave them names of young Austrian scholars and teachers who needed help to get out. And Chris finally found the position for Gombrich at the Warburg Institute in London in 1936. And this is how Gombrich was able to get out. And he just simply had not come to the conclusion yet that he would have to leave. Chris saw the danger very early. He saw it very early. So it is. So here's an example of the psychoanalyst Ernst Chris and the young scholar E.H. Gombrich, and it was the psychoanalyst who saw what was happening more clearly. And I think for Chris later, trying to get a grip on the politics of the country and society where you were was extremely crucial to orienting yourself, extremely crucial. And after the war, I mean, Chris's great concern from the mid to the late 40s was that the anti-New Dealers would come back. And he wrote to Gombrich about this, what he described as the old normalcy crowd, who were the anti-New Dealers and who wanted to see FDR's accomplishments reversed. He was very concerned that this would happen. And he was concerned that something like this would happen in Britain. And he urged Gombrich not to return to scholarship right away, but keep his contacts within the government and now do some work for the new Labour government that had come to power in London. And this side of Chris's consciousness coexists with his other work and his other types of awareness.
Mhm.
I want to put you on the spot, Daniela, but do you have anything to say to that question? Because
Sorry, I was reading another question and I was looking for information. I didn't follow the
That's fine, don't
last
worry about
part.
it.
I'm sorry.
never mind.
We have a lot of interesting questions
Yeah.
and some comments, but Danielle, I don't know if one is standing out for you or.
Yeah, I was just I was intrigued by the question about the European analysts who would go to South America, like Willy and Madeleine Baranchi or Mary Langer. They didn't have to struggle with the American ego psycho school. I'm curious about your thoughts about this. Is one participant writing? So what about immigration in South America without ego psychology?
Well, that's certainly
I
what.
wonder also if the politics were easier as well, whether it was the political situation in South America was less sort of dominated by the right. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Otto Kernberg went to South America, and he's, to my mind, he's an object relations theorist, and he has said he's an object relations theorist. He's often cast as an ego psychologist, but I think that was really critical in his formation. But again, I don't want to make make a too neat connection between life experience and theory, but he was not subjected to the same kind of pressures in that way. I mean, I think it's interesting that both the theorists who upset the American analytic establishment came from Vienna, were there when Freud entered, experienced fascism in that way, in a very direct way, as Thomas mentioned, of the helplessness and the fear and so on. And they both wrote a lot about fascism and attraction to the leader and to the narcissistic leader and so on. There's a lot of writing in both Otto Kernberg and Heinz Kowitz's work about this. Really quite brilliant writing.
One person raises a question that I think you've already spoken to, but maybe we can speak a little bit more about it. They say they appreciate the au courant quality of today's discussion, but what about the ego psychologist view of psychoanalysis as a science and coming to America with that vision where they continued it? How do you think that contributed to the methodologically formal and authoritarian quality that you've discussed?
I'll jump in there. I think it's part and parcel of it. I don't think it's a contribution. I think it's all part of the same. They wanted to make a general science of humanity, a science of human nature. And I think they had a very sort of material, empirical vision of what a science was. It's still a question that engages psychoanalysis. I teach in a department of the history of science. No one has ever asked me, is psychoanalysis a science? Not once. I teach 300 undergraduates in a science general education course. No one asks, is psychoanalysis a science? It all depends on what you mean by science. So I think calling it a science isn't the problem, isn't like the motor behind the problem. It's just a way of describing a kind of outlook that we're objective, we're empirical, and so on. It's very hard to make psychoanalysis legible to science.
This is, I'll add to this in another way, because the Europeans did not view it this way. This is very much an American way of bringing it in. The critics, and we've been talking about this, Ernst Chris was an art historian. They never, one of the things that was lovely from the moment I met Tony was like, I was really, I was only there because I was viewed as a researcher, which I really wasn't. And I had told them I wasn't from the beginning, but that was my legitimacy. PhDs were not allowed to be analysts. And this is an American version, not a European one. The Europeans didn't have that attitude.
I'm just sort of thinking about the sort of origins of the relational group, which is 20 years late, in the 1980s, but it was really Mitchell's vision of the 1960s, and it was filled with people like Muriel Dimon and Lou Aaron and Jessica Benjamin and myself, who had been activists in the 60s, and there was a absolutely not only anti-science, but actually quite determinedly left-wing liberal sensibility that was sort of in the system from early on in Mitchell's writing. And it was part of the way I think he separated from Jay Greenberg, who had, I think, a very different kind of politics and ideology. But I think the relational group was actually powerfully influenced by the 60s and feminism and et cetera.
Last week at the American Psychoanalytic Association meeting, there was a plenary given on Saturday afternoon by Peter Goldberg. And towards the end of that plenary, he sort of summed up a sort of historical timeline for psychoanalysis. It's a bit reductionistic, but maybe a useful heuristic to think about. He said, the first 50, 60, 70 years, psychoanalysis was concerned with Freud and the unconscious. And to this discussion, I think I would add ego psychology, perhaps. And then he said the second phase was intersubjective and relational. And the last 30 or 40 years, we've been taken up with the intersubjective and relational. But now there's a turn in psychoanalysis to the social. And the issue clinically is going to be on belonging. And I think it does bring back in Erikson's ahead of his time, emphasis on the social and the cultural and identity, and the great emphasis we see right now on identity and finding an affinity group to belong to in some way. But I think authoritarianism in various ways traffics through all of these developments as each group or each epoch vies for position, that authoritarianism maybe is so much a part of American culture at this point that it appears in the most unlikely places.
The only thing, Jane, I'd say to that, because I have a dual identity, the authoritarianism doesn't exist in history. At least it hasn't until maybe very, 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 very recently. There's a unique psychoanalytic authoritarianism that I can tell you what a joy it was to leave the world of psychoanalysis and become a member of a history department where it wasn't so judgmental, and there wasn't the phrase, that's all fine, but that's not psychoanalysis. People don't say that about history. That's fine, but that's not history.
I totally agree. Having spent time in an institute and in the American, the authoritarianism is alive and well, and it is not in the history profession. It's just a completely different frame of mind.
And how, this whole roundtable today, I think, is trying to address the question, how does it come about and how does it persist?
Yeah.
Something for us to continue.
Well, I think Tom's writing that book, right? All will be revealed.
So, Liz, I find that very depressing because I really thought things were different. I really thought, at least, I know that the attitudes at least by my friends and cohorts at the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute is very non-authoritarianism.
I think it's not so evident, but it's subtly different from what you would find in a history department. I think if you look at some of the struggles now going on in the American, Is there
Oh,
any-
and the American, yes.
Yeah, I'm not talking about Bipsy.
I
I'm
would-
talking about the American. I'm
Yeah.
talking
No, I
about.
would agree. I think that's absolutely true. And it is very depressing in this way. And maybe there's something that's very important in having some other outside perspective. And I know for me, that's literature, and that's where I live, and that's where I read, and that's what I think about. And that actually is more informative to me than most of the psychoanalytic readings. So maybe there's something about a broader way of thinking about things and, not getting caught that way. But it is, yes, I would agree. I see it as the American too.
Well, we are at our time boundary, so I want to thank all of you for joining us today, our panelists, for a wonderful discussion. As a reminder, the information on how to receive CME has been in the chat, and it can take up to 24 hours for your attendants to register in our Ethos educational system. We hope you'll join us for the third roundtable in this series on March 11th. Refugees and Immigrants, their experience and contribution to psychoanalysis in North America. We'll be looking at genocide and what psychoanalysis lost in the Holocaust.
Could you put again in the chat about how we get CE credit?
Yep, it's been in the chat, and you'll also receive an email
Okay,
from
perfect.
us about that. So thank you very much, Tom, and all our panelists.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank
Thank
you
you so much. Goodbye.